Hello and welcome. Will the India-Mid-East-Europe Economic Corridor serve as a counter to China's BRI? Is this a revival of the ancient spice route to counter Xi Jinping's revival of the Silk Route? Is this in some ways a boats and rail initiative to take on the Belt and Road Initiative? That big international conversation which is creating a lot of chatter, not just in India, the Middle East and Europe, the US, but elsewhere, coming up on the NewsTrack tonight.
Historic India-Middle East EU corridor. Mega win from India's G20. This project puts China on notice. Spice route versus Silk route. Boat and rail versus Belt and Road. Geopolitical clash with historical roots. Big focus on NewsTrack.
One of the big takeaways of the G20 summit in India was the announcement of the India-Middle East-Europe corridor. This historic project puts China's BRI on notice as it's billed as a counter to Xi Jinping's designs to try and revive the ancient Silk Route. Now, William Dalrymple, well-known author and historian, has a new book coming out called The Golden Road, which actually talks about how this is not a new idea. The India-Mid-East-Europe corridor actually goes back to the classical era, goes back 2,000 years, and for about 1,000 years, how a lot of trade in the world actually happened between the Roman Empire and different empires in India through the Arab world. So there's this very fascinating conversation with William Dalrymple that's coming up in a moment. But before that, let's spend a moment to decode, dissect this new trade route. Then I'll have experts from the US, the Arab world, India, joining in to talk about this new corridor and whether Biden, Modi and MBS together can take on Xi Jinping's BRI.
A new era of diplomacy, a new age of connectivity. G20 leaders chart a fresh trade course, a multinational rail and ports deal, a groundbreaking initiative linking railways and shipping routes from India to the European Union, stretching across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Israel for swifter transit of goods and services.
आने वाले समय में यह भारत, पश्चिम एशिया और यूरोप के बीच इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन का प्रभावी माध्यम होगा। यह पूरे विश्व में कनेक्टिविटी और विकास को सस्टेनेबल दिशा प्रदान करेगा।
The United States has hailed it as a landmark endeavor, as India, the US, UAE, Saudi Arabia, France, Italy and the EU announced a pact at the G20 to boost economic development through enhanced global connectivity.
It's about creating jobs, increasing trade, strengthening supply chains, boosting connectivity, laying foundations that will strengthen commerce and food security for people across multiple countries. This is a game-changing regional investment, and both of these are huge steps forward.
Some view this as the New World Order's response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Launched in 2013, the BRI aimed to connect China with Europe and beyond by reviving the ancient Silk Road trade route.
might also explain the absence of Xi from G20 this time around. Not only did you see Italy withdrawing from the BRI, but you also saw a bunch of European nations joining up, teaming up with the Middle East and India to put together a new connectivity offering. Something, let's be very clear, is a determined alternative to the BRI. Now, this is $47 trillion of GDP in terms of the countries who have signed up for this agreement.
Yet some global strategists foresee significant challenges in developing the proposed corridor as a competitor to China's BRI.
This is still a comparatively small announcement in the context of the money that BRI is putting out around the world, even with China under more economic difficult circumstances today. It's over 10 years, the announcements of these investments going into this new corridor, a lot of private sector leverage. The initial U.S. commitment and contribution needs to be approved by Congress. That is not a trivial matter in the United States, either this year or going forward. So there still are big questions about how much American leadership can be committed for the medium to long term, given the political instability in the United States.
India clarifies its position, stating there's no need to draw parallels with China. This new trade route complements age-old practices of global commerce.
I really don't think everything needs to be compared with China. I mean, China does its thing; it's welcome to do it. But I think I as India don't have to do things because China is doing something. I as India have my interests, my rights, my ambitions, my opportunities and my friendships. And trying to do something which the world of commerce has done for 2000 years, which is to take two very important parts of the global economy, Europe and India.
The world reimagines commerce to redefine global trade dynamics. Bureau Report, India Today.
The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor announced at the G20 summit goes back to an ancient trade route between the Indian subcontinent and the Roman Empire. The existence of this trade route peaked in the early centuries of the Common Era, and it's been known for a long time. However, the scale of this ancient trade route is emerging only now. William Dalrymple, well-known author, historian, has a new upcoming book, The Golden Road, which delves into this subject in detail. And William Dalrymple now joins us on the NewsTrack. In fact, his argument is that this is a far more significant trade route than even the Silk Route, which China is trying to push as its idea for the Belts and Road Initiative. So thank you very much, Mr. Dalrymple, for joining us from London. Absolute pleasure having you with us. Could you start by explaining to our viewers, as we look at this India, Mid-East, Europe corridor in the current geopolitical context, can you give us a historical context in terms of the ancient roots of this trading route? Mr. Dalrymple, welcome.
Sure. I think when people anywhere in the world think about trade between Europe and Asia, the first thing that now comes to their mind is the idea of the Silk Road. That's this concept of an overland route, very romantic idea of camel caravans laden with silk and spices crossing the Pamirs. And the traditional conception of this is something that links China with the Mediterranean, with the Roman world in the Mediterranean. But actually, the Silk Road is a very modern idea. It was only invented in the 19th century by a German geographer called von Richthofen. It only came into the English language in the 1930s and only really became popular in the last 20 or 25 years. And has in a sense been militarized by Xi Jinping and the idea of the Belt and Road, the idea that this is an ancient trade route that could be revived. While if you look at the classical period, at the time of the Romans, the big east-west trade route was nothing to do with China at all. It was with India, and it happened not over land, but over the sea, up the Red Sea. And what allowed Indian sailors and the Romans to come backwards and forth with surprising ease was the winds of the monsoon. The Tibetan plateau heats up in summer and it cools in winter. And this creates a very predictable wind pattern, which allows you to sail from India to the Red Sea, to the Egyptian coast, in as little as 6 weeks if you've got the wind behind you. You then have to wait for the wind to turn, but you can then come back when it does in an equally quick time. 5 or 6 weeks is all it takes to sail from Egypt to India.
Okay.
And at the time of the Romans, this wasn't just sort of something that a few explorers and intrepid mariners did. This was a major world economic route. And we have records of the Roman geographer and economist Pliny complaining that all the gold in the Roman world was bucketing out towards India, because he said he was a very puritanical ex-soldier, and he said that all these decadent Roman women want to wear silk from India, they want gems to cover their breasts, they want all this sort of foreign exotica. He's saying, why can't they just be happy with good, Roman wool? And he says that there were 250 Roman cargo vessels alone, leaving just one port a year in his time, and sailing to India. And the ports in India was Bharuch, which is modern Gujarat, Muziris, which is near Cochin in Kerala, and the Paducah, which is beneath modern Pondicherry.
Could you explain the nature of this trade? What is the kind of material that Indian merchants were carrying to Europe? What's the kind of material that was coming from Europe to India? What was the balance of this trade? Were we exporting more? Were we importing more? How did this trade really operate?
We don't really know. What's clear from Pliny is that the balance of trade in terms of who's making the money is that the Indians are making the money. That the money is the Indians didn't want to buy much from Rome. They were interested in Roman wine. They liked Roman olive oil. They also liked a sauce called garum, which was a very popular fish sauce, which has actually been found in several port cities in India by archaeologists. It used to be exported in great big barrels. But in return, the Romans wanted very expensive things like ivory, spices, and gemstones. So the balance of trade overwhelmingly was in favor of India. And that's why you find tens of thousands of finds in India of Roman coins. In fact, there have been more Roman coins found in India than in any other country except Italy.
But there's so much talk about the Silk Route trade from China, Xi Jinping trying to present that as a historical fact over projecting the importance of the ancient Silk Route. From what you say, it seems that this spice route in the classical period is the actual route where a majority of the global trade happens. So why is it that there isn't enough known about the importance of this ancient route in contemporary times? Why is it seemingly such a novel idea when Biden, Modi, Mohammed bin Salman all announce it? The historical significance doesn't immediately come to people's minds.
Well, you're quite right. Well, there's two or three answers to that. First of all is that history, like everything else, goes in fashions. Just like, there are fashions in hemlines or the cut of a shirt or the way you wear a sari or whatever. So in history, there are fashions. And this idea of the Silk Road is such a romantic and exciting idea that it's slightly taken over everyone's sort of consciousness in the last 20 years. And we've forgotten to look at the hard data, which is there very clearly in the Roman documents and in the archaeology, which is dug up. The second reason, I think, is that Indian scholars are very, very good at doing their scholarly writing, but there's been less of a tradition of popularizing their research to ordinary people. I think that's beginning to change now with writers like, Manu Pillai or Anirudh Kunisetti coming up and making very good scholarly history accessible. But for years, I think, the work that scholars was doing was obscured by a lot of jargon in subaltern studies language and this sort of thing. So people were not reading the research that Indian scholars were doing. And I think the third thing is there's a lot of new evidence. There's been excavations in the last 10 years in Kerala at Maziris. There've been new excavations on the old site of the excavations that Mortimer Wheeler made at Arakamedu outside Pondicherry. And most excitingly, there's been a major excavation in Egypt at the main port that the Indian sailors used on arrival, which was a place called Berenike. And in the last couple of years, they found not only a wonderful, slightly Gandharan-style Buddha head, the first ever found in Egypt, and made locally, made in Alexandria, they think. But they've also found a very early triad of Hindu gods, of the early forms of Krishna and Balarama. And this turned up just last year, hasn't even been fully published yet. So there's a wonderful, anyone wants to go on YouTube, there's a wonderful archaeologist called Shailen Bandari, who's been talking about this at the Ashmolean, about Berenike. You can find that if you look online. But it's new evidence, and it's changing the picture. But the most exciting single piece of evidence, and this is the thing, in a sense, I think people should take away with them, is something called the Maziris Papyrus. Mm-hmm. And this is now it's a piece of historical document, a papyrus dug up in Egypt, probably at a site called Oxyrhynchus. It's now kept in a museum in Vienna. And when they studied it, it was a random survival in a rubbish dump. Someone had cleared out their house, all their papers got thrown into a heap, and the archaeologists dug it up. And what it is a random shipping invoice. A contract taken out by an Alexandrian Greek ship owner in the city of Alexandria, making a contract with a supplier, a merchant in Kerala. And it's a very modern document. They're listing the contents of the container. There's details about insurance, about, there's various legal things about what happens if the thing sinks and so on. And this document involves vast sums of money. A single container full of ivory that is put on one ship called the Hemaplon is listed out in this contract. And that container alone would have allowed the merchant, if it successfully arrived, safely avoided storms and sinking and pirates and everything else. If the whole thing arrived safely, the merchant would be able to buy one of the largest estates in India or Italy in its day. Wow. He would be like an Adani or a Ambani of Kerala, aged in 100 AD. And if one of these big Roman container ships, because we know the size of the berths of them at Berenike, they found the harbour where they used to dock, and they were enormous ships. Obviously smaller than a modern container, but a very large ancient ship could contain hundreds of these containers. And we know that just in one port, nearly 250 ships a year sailed to India, both Roman and India. You begin to feel this, and so they've done calculations, and they found that the customs take, when the Roman customs at the port demand a third of the value of this, the customs take from that one port alone would have paid for 1/3 of the Roman imperial budget. So, in other words, it's a vast source of wealth for the Roman exchequer. The very, very pricey luxuries coming in at their port in Egypt, entering the Roman Empire, and they take a cut of it. And that alone would have paid for 1/3 of the entire military budget of the empire. So we're talking vast sums of money. And it's, as a historian, to me, it's really interesting that, modern politics has meant that this has been revived. There's various reasons for that. But again, it's partly revived, I think, in competition with the Chinese. They have their Belt and Road, and they're promoting this historical idea of the Silk Road. And India, whether knowingly or unknowingly, has landed on a very ancient trade route that, in fact, probably was more important during the classical period than the Silk Road ever was.
Wow, that's fascinating. So fascinating. Boats and rail initiative of the modern era, as it were, to take on the Belt and Road initiative of Xi Jinping. So this is the trade that starts in India, goes to Europe. William Dalrymple, what's the role of the Arab world at that time in the early period of the classical era? What's the role of the Arab world in this trade? What's happening there?
So, complicated question. So first of all, during the Roman times, the Arabs were not place in a sense where we think of them today. So Egypt was not an Arab country in those days, and it was a Roman and a Greek and Egyptian country. There are three different races living in Egypt. So the Arabs at that point control areas such as Yemen and Aden, which controlled the frankincense route. And that was another of the very important imports into the Roman Empire, because it was what incense for temples was made from. And so that's part of it. But the famous period of Arab dominating the sea road comes, in a later period, when you have the Mamluks in charge of Egypt in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. And that's another great period of sea trade between India and the Mamluks, because the coast of India has many Muslim principalities on the western coast by that stage, who are trading directly with their co-religionists in Egypt and the Gulf. So this is something which is an essential part of Indian history, simply because the monsoon winds have always allowed sailors to do this. All Indians need to do, unlike any other nation in the world, is put up a sail, and they go in one direction for half the year, and they go in the other direction in the other half. It's a major natural asset of India, that it's always led to it being a great trading and seafaring nation. That's why you've got huge Indian diaspora all over the west, the east coast of Africa. It's why you've got Hindu temples all over Angkor Wat and the coast of Cambodia and Thailand. And this is the subject of my next book. It's called The Golden Road. It's about the diffusion of Indian ideas, using those monsoon winds to take them all over the world, but also to use the overland route to take Buddhism to China. And we always forget that Buddhism, an Indian religion, took over China for a bit of the Middle Ages, and that with Buddhism came ideas about yugas of time, Indian ideas of astronomy, astrology, magic, all sorts of Indian conceptions came, if you like, sort of hostage with the religion. As Buddhism became popular in China, so many other aspects of Indian science and Indian astronomy came with it. Okay. So there's a whole world that we've forgotten about the export of Indian ideas. And it's not in distant Vedic past. It's not some stuff, some people get very overexcited about the Vedic past and start talking about, internet and the Mahabharata and spaceships in the Ramayana and this sort of thing. It's none of that sort of highfalutin thing. This is solid historical stuff that's happening particularly between the 1st and 2nd century BCE through to about the 11th or 12th century CE. So about 1,000 years, India is exporting its ideas, exporting its science in a very real and tangible way. And you don't need to be a sort of hyper-nationalist to see this in very clear terms, the way that China becomes a Buddhist country, Southeast Asia has future Buddhist and Hindu monuments, and eventually Indian numbers and Indian science spreads first to the Arab world and finally belatedly in the 12th century to Europe, which is why we use Indian-derived numbers today.
Such a fascinating historical insight this. William Dalrymple, for joining me on the NewsTrack. Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you. Is this boats and rail initiative of India, the Arab world and Europe going to prove to be a strong counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative? Will the spice route get revived and really rise to its original conception in the way that you just heard historian William Dalrymple explain? Or has the Silk Route seeped in so deep that it's now difficult to reconfigure in the modern era? Joining us to talk about this and more, I have with me on this broadcast former Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibbal. We have with us Navdeep Singh Suri, Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, has been Ambassador to Egypt, the UAE and elsewhere. We have with us Andrew K.P. Loing, China strategist analyst, joining us from Hong Kong. And for a perspective from Washington, D.C., I have Michael Kugelman. I want to start by asking Kanwal Sibbal about the moment of this announcement on the sidelines of the G20. The details not fully out in terms of the exact route, but the idea is to revive the old spice route, India, the Arab world and Europe. Do you think that this has the capacity and the potency to be a strong counter to China's Belt and Road?
I think this initiative of India, Middle East, Europe corridor has a logic of its own, and we should not diminish its importance by talking about it as a competitor or a rival to the BRI. The BRI had a logic of its own.
But Navdeep Suri, what concerns me is the fact that some of these countries in the Arab world have fraught relations. You've served as an ambassador in different parts of the Arab world. At this moment, it seems that there is growing, not proximity, but there's at least the differences are being kept on the side. They're trying to work together, but we well know that that could change at any time. So you've made all this effort, made the investment, and relations turn, and we've seen this happen. There have been times when we've spoken about a Chabahar port, we've spoken about letting something pass through or near Pakistan, and then things change. So is that concern going to stay? That at this moment relations seem a certain way, at a point in time in the future relations could change?
Well, this is what the financial experts would call political risk, right? Which exists in many different dimensions. But I think, if we look at the map, really, apart from Europe, France, and Germany, where you wouldn't think much political risk, the House of Saud has been around for 100 years. In Saudi Arabia, the Nahyans have been ruling family in UAE for about 150 years now. So you would be able to call them reasonably stable monarchies in the context of monarchies. So I think the fact that the presidents of both UAE and Saudi Arabia were present around the table when this announcement was made, and previously in May, the national security advisors of the four countries had also met in Riyadh.
Yeah, but there's talk about Israel using the Haifa port as well as part of the same corridor.
Well, the relationship between Israel and UAE has transformed in the last 2 years post the Abraham Accords. There's a lot going on beneath the surface between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and we keep seeing reports about the Biden administration trying to stitch together a grand bargain where relations would also be established between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And by all accounts, the Saudis are not averse to the relationship in principle. It's just what can they get in return in terms of security guarantees from the Biden administration and some sort of a deal for the Palestinians. So there's a lot going on that. I think the relationship today, post the Abraham Accords, is far more positive and conducive to this kind of a corridor than it was even 3 years back.
Why is America pushing this so hard? Ultimately, if this is happening on the sidelines of the G20 in India, the role of President Biden and the American administration is crucial. That this improves trade between India, the Arab world, and Europe seems quite possible. What's in it for America?
I think,
Michael
from
Coogan.
the American... Okay.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think first, just a brief caveat. I think it's important. We don't want to jump the gun with this new project. Many of these grand connectivity corridors that have emerged in recent years haven't really panned out, and that includes the G7's Build Back Better initiative, even the Chabahar port issue. So I think that we need to be careful not to overstate just how far this is going to go. That said, to your point, this is very important from a U.S. perspective for several reasons. One is that I think it reflects a U.S. reset of its policy in the Middle East, which has been building for several years, moving away from a security-focused, militarized policy of the past where the U.S. was fighting wars in the Middle East and involved in counterterrorism activities. It's trying to move away from that and focus more on building partnerships with its close friends to pursue integration and trade. And, one reason for this is that the U.S. is not as reliant on energy supply as it had been in the Middle East in the past, and it's not fighting wars in the region for now. So it's trying to focus on building these broader types of longer-term commercial links with its allies and partners. I'd argue that the India factor is important here with the United States. It wants to work with India outside of the Indo-Pacific as the partnership expands and becomes stronger. And certainly the Abraham Accord issue is important here as well, as your last speaker noted. This is a big priority. One of the few foreign policy successes of the Trump administration that the Biden administration actually agrees with, the Abraham Accords. And indeed, I think from Washington, one of the hopes is that this corridor will build up more trade links and through that more goodwill and trust that could eventually lead Israel to normalize relations with more of its Arab neighbors, especially Saudi Arabia. And this, of course, builds on the I-2U2 project, which the U.S. is a big proponent of. Again, the idea is to build more trust and goodwill between Israel and its neighbors to try to create more formal relationships. And finally, I think that, yes, the China factor is critical here. I know that many participants in this corridor would not agree that this should be seen as a counter to China. But from a U.S. perspective, given the scope of U.S.-China competition, there is an idea here of presenting this corridor as an alternative to the investment model pursued by China's BRI. And we've already heard U.S. officials describe this as something that will be non-coercive, transparent, and that's a clear, an explicit contrast being drawn between this corridor and what the U.S. believes the Chinese investment model to be with BRI.
Let Andrew Lewing respond to this. Non-coercive, transparent, fiscally responsible, a direct counter to China's model of leaving countries indebted through the BRI project. So whether anybody says this on record or not in a government press conference, it's very clear that this is being done to show countries in this patch of the world that this is a different way of building infrastructure and public goods in comparison to the model that China has been pushing. How do you see it, Andrew Lewing?
Well, first of all, one has got to realize that the Belt and Road Initiative has been in place for over 10 years. And it is extremely extensive. It's got 6 economic corridors spanning all corners of the world, and nearly $1 trillion have been invested, even though some of them there is blowback and concerns in some quarters. But that's understandable because these are part of the learning curve of any pioneer. But as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, it is based on the fact that China is the largest trading partner to 128 countries around the world across the group, and not just in single region. And that's why there are 6 economic corridors. And it's based on the real trade, and the host countries have a very close trading partnership. I think China's the greatest trading partner. 128 countries compared with only 58 for the United States, let alone India. So the idea that this India, Middle East, and Europe corridor is going to displace the Belt and Road is a bit of
No, it's not about displacement. I don't think, Mr. Lewing, it's about displacement. It's about showing an alternative model. China building infrastructure a certain way, leaving countries in Africa and elsewhere deeply indebted. India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, America getting together to show that infrastructure can be built a different way as well. So it's not about displacement, it's about offering an alternative instead.
Well, I think that China welcomes this Indian initiative because the more the world is connected, the more China, as the largest trading nation, would benefit. I don't think that China regards this new initiative negatively. And as far as the perceived problems of the Belt and Road is concerned, as I said, as part of the learning curve, as for indebtedness, it's instructive that a UK-based think tank, a UK-based charity called Debt Justice released a report only recently. They look at the indebtedness of a lot of developing countries, and they found that, in fact, they own most of their debt to Western commercial lenders rather than to China. So I'm not saying that China is exceedingly, sort of whiter than white. But on the other hand, as I said, it's part of the learning curve, and the debt resilience of the host countries is a big area for China to study.
But as far as Mr. Luing, that China didn't necessarily want to leave the beneficiary countries indebted because they were doing it for the first time. It's a learning curve for them, or do you think part of this whole effort is to lend, to build, but actually then, whether it's a Hambantota or elsewhere, to take over the asset and to make it your own?
Well, that criticism is very widespread, and countries are becoming very alert to this, including in Africa. So there is a bit of a blowback with regard to the BRI. And there is a belief that China itself is walking away a little bit from this project, at least at the government level, and leaving it to the banks to support it, because they know many of these loans that they have offered will not be paid back. But they'll let China deal with its own problems. But I'll come back to a very important issue, which is that both UAE and Saudi Arabia are part of the BRI project. Now, if we try and push the line that it is to compete with China and project it as a rival to China's BRI, I don't think it serves any larger purpose. Sure. The second thing is, and that's very important, if you look at what is intended, whether it is achieved fully or not is a different matter. It is a shipping hub between our ports and the Arabian coast, with green hydrogen, green ammonia, digital connections, telecommunications, pipelines under the sea, and then going on to through UAE, Saudi Arabia to Israel. Now, important thing also is that in the MOU that has been signed, which the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has signed, there is a specific mention of the route that this corridor will take, and Israel is mentioned by name. So if Saudi Arabia had some serious concerns about Israel in this regard, they won't have.
No, but are you concerned that could change? Do you now see this as being irreversible? Are you concerned this could change?
No, it won't change. It won't change because, as I said, it will actually be a failure of Saudi diplomacy if, having signed this in the presence of not only India, forget India for a moment, in the presence of Biden, in presence of Scholz, in presence of Macron, in the presence of the Italy's prime minister, and then walking back for it because of Israel, it doesn't make sense. If that was the concern, then in the initial discussions on this, they would have tried to devise a route which bypassed Haifa. But that is not the case. Therefore, I don't think we should exaggerate it to that extent where there can be a walking back. Now, it may be that they may not be able to implement it in the time frame they have in mind. Within 2 months, they're going to discuss the modalities of it and the financing of it, and then they'll take a firm and final decision about how this project will be implemented. But the project is very good, very forward-looking.
And Navdeep Suri, you heard from William Dalrymple about ivory, perfume, silk. Yes.
Last point, Rahul, very, very briefly, which is that the BRI has now been blocked because of the Ukraine conflict and the walking away of European countries, including the Baltic states, away from the BRI. So that original idea of connecting China to Europe through BRI, it will not work anymore in the foreseeable future. And this is an alternative route to Europe, which has a lot of potential. Sorry.
Navdeep Suri, we heard from William Dalrymple when he spoke of ivory, silk, spices, perfumes being the exports from India to Europe in the early years of the classic era. What do you see now as largely being stuff which Europe can send to India, India can send to Europe? from this route? Because why I ask this is, you don't want a situation where you build this infrastructure and then it doesn't get optimally utilized and it becomes a white elephant of sorts.
Well, before we jump from William's fascinating comments 2,000 years back to today, I think let's take a pause 1,000 years in between during the medieval period, when the Arab sailors from Aden and Sharjah had discovered the patterns of the monsoon winds and were able to ride the winds both ways and actually expand the routes. So the route at that time was for the ships to catch the monsoon winds, arrive at Sharjah or Aden or Basra, and then via camel. That was the route across the desert to take the materials to either an Egyptian port just south of Safaga or to the Mediterranean directly. But the shortest route to the Nile was from Safaga, and then it would be put on boats and taken to the Mediterranean and onward to Europe. So the route that William talked about wasn't just then. Today, if you look at it, our largest trading partner as a bloc is the GCC. It's $240 billion of trade. And the shipping routes, the capacities, the linkages are very, very well established between particularly our West Coast ports from Kandla, Mundra, Nhava Sheva, Kochi, all the way down to the Gulf ports. India's third largest trading partner as a bloc, second largest actually, is the European Union. And so right now, all of the stuff that goes through these routes, particularly to Europe, goes through the Suez Canal. I think what COVID taught us, what that ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal taught us, is the importance of redundancy. It's the importance of building resilience in your supply chains, not being dependent completely on just one track. So even while the financials of this are going to be worked out, I think it's important that we look at it firstly as an alternate with some redundancy built in, which creates an alternate corridor to the Suez Canal. But secondly, very important that we also look at it in the context of other conversations about trusted data pipelines, right? If we are talking about not just goods exports, but service exports to take place, then you don't want pipelines that can be hacked or compromised by other players. You also bring in the Prime Minister's comment about one sun, one planet, one grid. And the fact that you can have electricity grids connected, and there's already conversations going on between India and UAE, India and Saudi Arabia on grid interconnectivity using solar from both sides. I think these are very ambitious plans, and it's important not to just focus ourselves on physical movement of goods, but movement of products that you don't think of seeing, which are not visible.
That's an important point you make. The more I think about this, the deeper the logic seems to be behind this announcement, Michael Kugelman. Do you see the assets, whether they are in the form of data pipelines, hydrogen pipelines, oil pipelines, railways, being fully juiced out and optimally utilized? Are you concerned, like with the BRI, some of it could end up as a white elephant, could take for years, decades maybe, for it to fully come to life in the way that it's being spoken of?
Well, absolutely. That's why I had cautioned caution at the beginning of this discussion, and that when you have an initiative that's so ambitious with so much scale, when you have so many participants covering so much territory, including some pretty fraught, volatile spaces, both in terms of land and sea, you really have to, I think, be careful with the expectations for sure. Though, I would argue that one reason to be a bit more optimistic about this project compared to some of the previous ones that have been pitched but never got anywhere is that these are countries and regions that really do want to work together, and I think we've been talking about that a lot. I mean, India, of course, views the Middle East as a critically important strategic space where it's been illustrating for a number of years its desire to scale up commercial relations because of energy interests and others. The U.S. continues to be very keen to engage with its allies and partners in the Middle East. And certainly, Europe wants to be a big part of this too. I mean, the main objective certainly is commercial interests, money making and so on. But I think the broader diplomatic and geopolitical incentives are very strong as well. But yeah, I mean, you look at the BRI case, I'd argue that of all of these big connectivity corridors that have emerged in recent years, BRI has made the most progress, even though it's run into a lot of setbacks. If you look at it a decade later, China clearly is very entrenched in terms of its investment presence throughout much of these spaces that are envisioned.
Final words, Andrew Lewing. On the BRI, word now coming out that the one country in Europe which was part of the BRI, Italy, has communicated formally to President Li Qiang when he was in Delhi that they intend to pull out. Earlier it was spoken of as a possibility. Apparently Giorgia Meloni, when she met with the Chinese premier, has told him that they want out. Now China was hoping in fact to get more European countries on board. Given that the one European country the BRI had on board is now exiting, how big a blow is that to the credibility of the BRI, especially when it comes to China's relations with Europe?
Well, I think that everything depends on the real benefits. And then there was originally a great deal of hype on part of the Italians. And then they have this buyer's remorse, which is understandable, but it doesn't mean that it applies to other major trading partners of China, like Germany, for example. Germany is a very large exporter, not importer, but exporter to China. So obviously, the BRI offers a much more efficient kind of link, and that applies to many other countries. And in fact, it's not a unified picture because the BRI covers so many countries and so many different routes as a six economic corridors. And according to the latest World Bank report, which was out a couple of months ago, the BRI, looking at the BRI from the, of course, that there is apart from a negative side, that on a positive side, it has lifted something like 440 million people out of poverty in many host countries.
Okay.
And then creating 420,000 local jobs. So it's not as if the BRI is a complete failure, by no means. And in fact, the benefit from any infrastructural link, you've got to be an extensive
absolutely.
trader.
BRI can't be called a failure. If it wasn't a strong idea, there wouldn't be this pushback. The fact that countries like India, the Saudi Arabia, UAE, America, Europe are coming together is by itself a pushback, and to build an alternate model. So there's a deep idea here. Lots of things have been touched upon in this particular broadcast. Let's actually see how it pans out, because as Michael Kugelman warned, you can have a great idea, but to translate an idea as enormous in size and scope into reality is a whole different matter altogether. For the time being, Andrew Lewing, Kanwal Sibbal, Navdeep Suri and Michael Kugelman for joining me on the NewsTrack. Thank you very much. I'm slipping into a quick break. We'll have more for you when we come back on the other side. Back in a moment. Stay with us.
India's biggest international event, India's most amazing global power flex, and India watched it on one channel. The biggest team from the venue, the most watched anchors, blazing fast images and news breaks, and first with the only voices that matter. The end result, total viewership domination. India has a new national consensus. Bharat watches India today.
Bolstering offensive capabilities against an aggressive China, India embarks on a monumental endeavor. Defence Minister Rajnath Singh poised to lay the virtual cornerstone of the Neoma airfield in the high reaches of Ladakh on Tuesday. A groundbreaking project situated over 13,000 feet above sea level, engineered to accommodate fighter aircraft, state-of-the-art radars and enhanced surveillance drones. Strategically positioned, a mere stone's throw away, less than 50 kilometers from the line of actual control.
From Kargil to Neoma is probably as much as Manali to Delhi, or twice as much as Chandigarh to Delhi. That is the kind of distance we are talking about in this area. So if anyone comes from Leh, DBO or Thois to bear over the Demchok Phukche region, which is the hotbed, or the Spangur Gap region, which is again the hotbed, or Chushul, which is again the hotbed, or Pengongso, which is where even Navy could fight a battle on the Pengongso Lake. So for anyone to come and bear over there, it is going to take at least 30 minutes, though they can fly so fast. From Neoma, it is not even going to take 4 to 5 minutes.
The third of its kind in Ladakh, Neoma joins Leh and Thois as an indispensable part of India's defense infrastructure. Reflecting on the peak of tensions during the 2020 Galwan incident, India's commitment to strengthening its military presence in this unforgiving landscape remains unwavering.
This is a response to what China has been doing in the last 3 years. Several air bases have sprung up in Aksai Chin. Many of their old air bases were revamped in this time period. That's the reason why India thought it's extremely crucial to have a fully operational fighter aircraft base as close to Neoma, which is 50 kilometers from LAC, adding to Thois and Leh, which are capable of operating fighter aircraft.
Meanwhile, the Indian Air Force will also receive advanced Israeli drones for enhanced surveillance. The nation's dedication to safeguarding its borders and detecting potential Chinese activities runs deeper than ever before. With Abhishek Bhalla, Bureau Report, India Today.
Apple has unveiled the all-new iPhone 15 series. The new phones will open for pre-booking on the 15th of September and will hit the markets on the 22nd of September. Apple has also finally made the switch to the USB-C cable, which allows you to charge all your Apple devices with the same cord.
These are the best and most capable iPhones we've ever made.
Apple CEO Tim Cook and executives at the company unveiled its latest devices in a recorded presentation Tuesday. The new lineup includes the iPhone 15 and 15 Pro, which has a titanium case and a faster chip. The 15 starts at $799, while the 15 Pro starts at $999. Apple chose not to raise prices during a tough period globally for smartphone sales. Both the Pro and other iPhone 15 models will have a brighter display and a 48-megapixel camera, as well as 100% recycled cobalt in their batteries. The new product announcements come amid lingering economic uncertainty, especially in China, Apple's third-largest market. It faces challenges there from expanded restrictions on using its iPhones in government offices, and the first new flagship phone in several years from Huawei Technologies. The announcements largely met expectations, and Apple's shares were down nearly 2% after the first hour of the event. Apple also showed off a new Series 9 watch with a feature called Double Tap, where users tap their thumb and finger together twice without touching the watch in order to perform tasks like answering a phone call. Here's Apple Chief Operating Officer Jeff Williams.
It uses a machine learning algorithm to detect the unique signature of tiny movements and changes in blood flow when your hand and fingers perform a double tap.
Cook also said Apple is on track to ship its Vision Pro mixed reality headset early next year.
This is where we wrap up the NewsTrack tonight. For your time and your trust, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you 8 p.m. tomorrow evening. Till then, from all of us here, goodbye, good night.
formal transition to the brand new parliament, a formal entry into the new building on September 19, a day after the special session begins. The occasion also brings with it a new uniform for parliament staff. Billed as a design with an Indian touch, the uniform consists of a magenta or deep pink Nehru jacket for bureaucrats, their shirts in deep pink with lotus in print. Manipuri turbans will now be worn by marshals in both houses. Opposition parties not very impressed though. Congress has issued a sarcastic reaction, insisting it's still in the dark about the agenda for the upcoming special session, while all other sundry information is being rolled out in public domain. Congress MP Manikam Tagore questioned the lotus print on the new uniform, calling it a petty display of the ruling BJP party symbol in the dress code for employees.
BJP party symbol is lotus. How cheap we are. In G20 also we did it, and now also we are doing it. And then we will say that it is a national flower. This kind of pettiness is not right. Hope the BJP grows up and not make the parliament a one-sided partisan.
The BJP pointed out that parliament protocols come under the purview of the House Chair and not the government.
पार्लियामेंट का सारा विषय माननीय स्पीकर साहब के क्षेत्राधिकार में आता है, इस पर मैं कोई टिप्पणी नहीं करूंगा.
A sartorial debate before the inaugural sitting in the new parliament building, triggered by the new uniform for parliament staff. Bureau Report, India Today.
सन्नी पाजी के साथ it was amazing working with him. He becomes a different person जब we start camera action. मैं बोलता हूँ आपको धाड़ एक तरफ बाकी सब एक तरफ ले. ऐसा यूज किया कि यूज भी नहीं किया, यूज भी कर दिया. वेडनेसडे को जाके देखूंगा.
Hello everyone, this is Anita Brito in conversation with the one and only Shyam Kaushal. Hello sir, कैसे हो आप?
Hello, नमस्कार जी.
Firstly, very good morning आपको. Thank you हमारे साथ जुड़ने के लिए आज.
Thank you, it is my pleasure. आप लोग.
आज स्पेशली हम मिले हैं बहुत सारी चीज़ों के बारे में बात करने के लिए आपसे. So first, let me begin by asking you. It's been 43 years for you. हमने वो छोटा सा आपका क्लिप भी देखा ऑनलाइन जो आपने डाला था, and it really touched me. So I want to start by asking, how has been your journey this 43 years? What were the highlights of this journey?
मतलब ऐसा मैं देखूं तो सिर्फ एक ही बोल सकता हूं, भगवान का जितना शुक्रिया अदा करूं कम है. क्योंकि 43 इयर्स पहले जब भी मैं गांव से आके पहले 1 साल जॉब किया, जॉब में कुछ नहीं कर पाया, तो फिर मैं स्टंटमैन बना, तो मेरे को मालूम नहीं था जर्नी कहाँ पे लेके जाएगी. मैं तो सर्वाइवल के लिए स्टंटमैन बन गया था, पैसे मिलेंगे, रोटी मिलेगी, तो रहने की कोई जगह नहीं थी. पर आगे ऐसे जैसा भगवान ने डेस्टिनी चाहा तो अच्छे लोग मिलते गए, रास्ते